Welcome to History of Economic Thought 2 at Hillsdale College. Today what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about development economics. When we left off, we had finished our macroeconomics. In macro, we particularly addressed the idea of the business cycle. Now, typically in macroeconomics, we talk about business cycle theory, that tends to be short run, and then we talk about economic growth, that would be long run. If I were going to talk about the macroeconomics of long run growth, I'd probably be starting with something like talking about Robert Solow and the Solow growth model, move into endogenous growth modeling with Paul Romer, things like that. But instead of that, we're going to tackle growth from a little bit different angle, and I'm going to talk about the history of development economics. But the question is, why are some countries successful and some countries are not? Why do some grow and some don't? And that question goes way back, goes back to the mercantilists, back to the physiocrats, and of course, Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations. And Smith, Malthus, Jean-Baptiste Say, David Ricardo, John Ray, John Stuart Mill, all of them are possessed with this question. They're asking, why is it that an economy grows? When we move to neoclassical economics, there is very much a shift in the focus of economics. And economists begin studying economizing, allocation. They focus particularly on the microeconomics, price theory, theories of value, ideas of individual decision making, and what are the conditions of equilibrium. Or for the Austrians, what are the processes that go on outside of equilibrium. So there's less attention to economic growth theory. Now, of course, the Marxists and the Soviets treat it as a primary issue, but they don't develop very good answers. In fact, they develop bad answers, as we've seen. And of course, Western economists, some of them begin thinking that maybe socialism is actually superior to the market system. After all, there was no Great Depression in the Soviet Union. That's an empirical argument. And because they don't understand the socialist calculation debate, many think there's a strong theoretical argument that socialism can work and perhaps outperform the market system. Well, the bottom line of this is that in the early period, first 50 years, 70 years of neoclassical economics, there's not very much attention given to this theory of economic growth. But here are the origins of development economics. There's a series of world crises. And starting in the 1910s, late 1910s, we have World War I, and then we have the Bolshevik Revolution. Followed by, in the 1920s, there's the German hyperinflation, and then there are other European hyperinflations. Then we get to the 1930s, and what happens? We get the Great Depression. That's a worldwide phenomenon. International trade during the Great Depression falls to 10% of what it had been in the previous years. Now, I should mention that there's no serious economic theory that says that that caused the Great Depression, but it is more a result of, first of all, the breakdown of the system. It didn't cause the business cycle. It certainly accentuated the damage and the harm. We get to the 1930s, and we also have the rise of Nazism and the rise of fascism. And of course, then that brings the 1940s, and we have the Second World War. So that brings us to 1945. In the post-war world, the general attitude of people who have survived this is this: the world cannot survive crises like these ever again. Today we now have nuclear weapons. We can't have something like this happen again. It's too much. And so we need to build a world framework that will help to stop problems like this from accelerating. And the first thing that is developed is, the first thing to come is the United Nations, the UN. That comes out of the Allies. That was actually the official name of the Allied forces. The Allied nations were the United Nations. So the United Nations becomes an organization, and its job will be dispute resolution among countries. And the second thing will be the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF, its job will be international macroeconomic stability to stop another Great Depression, for example. The third part of this world framework will be the World Bank. And this will be for reconstruction and development to repair the damage after this great cataclysmic World War II. And then the fourth part of the framework is the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And this is to restore and guarantee, protect international trade. Now that one was not ratified by the US Congress, and so it did not become the fourth international agency the way the others did. We do now have the WTO, but it took quite a while to get to that. Well, the World Bank is an important part of this development story because the World Bank, its initial focus is on rebuilding from the cataclysms of war and depression. It's not focused on less developed countries or the third world or anything like this, but it is obvious to people that most of the world is not developed. Post-World War II, what we see is a breakdown of the old colonial system. Africa and Asia, many of those places were colonized, and they now start to become independent countries. The number of independent countries explodes in Africa, for example, and so we have all these small now third world countries. Only Ethiopia in Africa, only Ethiopia and Liberia had not been colonized. At this time, we also see the world splitting into two camps. There is the West, led by the United States, and then there's the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union. And so we have the Cold War. In the third world, the rest of the world becomes the main battleground for this. Sometimes it's military, but often it is political, economic, and ideological. And so by the 1950s, the developed world takes an interest in the LDC, less developed country growth. And it invents this idea of development economics. And so it's born out of the Cold War, in a sense. And the tendency of this field of economics is to become normative and prescriptive, and it becomes the province of experts who will plan growth. They're going to decide how it can happen. And let me give you a typical example, and this is a famous professor, Walt Rostow, 1916. Walt Rostow, and he lived from 1916 to 2003. He was a professor at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was an economic advisor to Presidents Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and President Johnson. In 1960, he published a book, The 5 Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. So we'll write that out. 1960, he publishes The 5 Stages of Economic Growth. And I won't write the subtitle, but it is a non-communist manifesto. And he posits these 5 stages that he says any country will go through. So this goes back to Adam Smith and all the others that we've spoken of who developed their stages of growth. And he argues that an economy will first be in what he calls traditional. The traditional economy, so this could be a hunter-gatherer economy, this could be agriculture, something like this. But then for him, the next step is what he calls the preconditions. And the preconditions, or we could say preconditions to take off, that is the beginning of a commercial economy. They begin establishing the basis of what will be the next step, which is takeoff. And takeoff means, for him, industrialization. They begin to modernize, put in factories instead of farms and hunting and gathering and raising livestock and things like this. And they begin industrializing. The next step then is what he calls the drive to maturity. And the drive to maturity is building this industrial sector and making it the dominant part of the economy. Drive to maturity, that's where we get the growth of industry. And industry grows, and that leads us to the next step, which is his fifth, which is mass consumption. And that's where we begin, where consumers begin reaping the benefits, where we've got consumer goods galore. The shift goes from, instead of building factories and plants and heavy industry, we now begin making consumer goods like toasters and ovens and atlatls and whatever it is that consumers are looking for. And so this is his story of how a country goes from being a traditional economy to suddenly becoming a modern one. And he actually predicts that there could be one more step. I may as well put that one in. This was somewhat speculative on more speculative, but this is what he calls beyond consumption. And that's where the economy, where the people are really wealthy and stable, and we are, it's a somewhat questionable just exactly what that would be. But take a look at this, because this right here is very similar to what the Soviets had imagined. Preobrazhensky, Bukharin, and Stalin, when they thought, well, what we have to do is we've got basically a traditional economy, we will begin investing, and then we can take off by building on that through the industrialization. This becomes the formula that people in development economics think must be applied to the developing world. We will invest, industrialize, and then build a consumer base and demand. Those first two steps, invest and industrialize, why, that's just like the Soviets. Modernize. Well, how do we do that? There are various models that are developed for promoting this. And I'm going to give you one that comes from Sir Arthur Lewis. I like it. It's kind of an interesting model. And Lewis himself is an interesting person. I might sound a little bit critical of him. I kind of like him in many respects. But Sir Arthur Lewis on the Lewis two-sector model. So we'll cover this one. And clear my board here. And we get Sir Arthur Lewis up here. He is knighted for his work. He receives a Nobel Prize. Let's see, he lived 1915 to 1991. 1915 to 1991, he was a professor. Well, he was a graduate student at London School of Economics. He then went to Manchester and ended up at Princeton University in the United States. He received his Nobel Prize in 1979. He was born in St. Lucia, which is in the Caribbean, small island country, and his parents were school teachers. His father died when Lewis was 7 years old, and his mother raised her 5 sons by herself. And here's how Lewis describes her. He says, she was the most highly disciplined and hardest working person I've ever known. She pushed her son, and he graduated at age 14 from high school. And he became a clerk in the British Civil Service. In 1932, he's quite smart. In 1932, he won a scholarship that took him from St. Lucia to the British university system, and he was allowed to basically pick his school and program, except he faced what was called the color bar. most occupations were barred to black people, and he's black. And so he decided to study business because business was open. And he entered the London School of Economics. He didn't even know what economics was, he says, but he started studying it and he was pretty successful. In fact, so successful that in 1937, they admitted him to their PhD program. The department chairman, a man by the name of Friedrich Hayek, you might have heard of, asked Lewis if he wouldn't teach a course in recent economic history. And Lewis said, well, I don't know anything about that, really. And Hayek says, well, there is no better way to learn a subject than to teach it. And so he said, okay, and he taught it. He taught economic history. Well, his first job after graduating with his PhD, 1948, he goes to the University of Manchester and they ask him to teach development economics. What's that? Well, there isn't a such thing. But as he says, following Hayek's rule that the best way to learn is to teach, he develops it. He starts doing research and work on economic development. And he says that he could not understand how the relative price of coffee and steel were both determined by utility. And he also came across historical data that suggested to him that wages were stagnant in the first 50 years of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And he was thinking about it, and suddenly he had in his mind a solution. He said, suppose that the neoclassical assumption that labor is scarce is wrong. Suppose that actually there's a lot of labor, more than is necessary, so that the marginal product of labor is zero. He thinks about it a bit and he develops what is called the Lewis two-sector model. And so we will develop that. The Lewis two-sector model. And this is often called a classical model, not neoclassical. It's classical in the sense that, first of all, there are two sectors of this economy. And we'll see. There'll be a modern sector and a traditional sector. And we will also see that it is, in the traditional sector, it is not the marginal product of labor that determines the wage rate. And so this becomes a classical, much more of a sort of a Ricardian model in a sense. Interestingly, in part, remember our Soviet lecture and the way that the Soviets collectivized agriculture? In part, this is a formalization of the Soviet planning model that was used for collectivization of agriculture. Lewis himself says so. And he says, this model describes a less developed country. Neoclassical economics describes a developed country. They're different. And so here's the model. And the model has, as it turns out, two sectors. And so we'll start out. There is the modern or the industrialized sector. These are the sectors. Well, I guess we'll write that down so that's clear. The sectors are, first of all, the modern, and that uses capital. And initially, it is small. It's a very small sector. So it's an industry. You could think of this as being industry or a small urban area, or it could even be modern agriculture in some settings. But it's a small, modern part of the economy. But then the country will have a traditional sector, and the traditional sector is big. And it is, well, I'll just say big, and it is agricultural and rural. And we'll leave it at that. We can think of this one as being industrial. Could be modern agriculture or something, but simple enough. And also another assumption is we'll treat this with a fixed population. So our population is, we'll just fix it at L bar, whatever that number happens to be, whatever the workforce is, in other words. That dictates the size of the workforce. In both sectors, we have diminishing marginal product of labor. both in the traditional sector and the modern sector. But this population is large, so initially, marginal product of labor in the traditional sector is equal to 0. And that's because there's a very large number of people. And the wages then, it can't be that people are being paid nothing to work because people would starve. So how are wages distributed, or how is that determined? And he says that the wages in the traditional sector, which we will call WT, the wages will be equal to the total product of labor in the traditional sector divided by the amount of labor that's in the traditional sector. That is to say, it's the average product of labor in the traditional sector. Here's the way this works. In the traditional sector, everybody goes to work, or people go to work, and they produce output, and then the village chief or the mayor or whomever is in charge, extended family, whoever is the leader, will simply divide up everything according to everyone gets a share. Okay, some traditional rule, tribal rule or cultural norm, something like this. And that's the way the wages will be determined there. It's not John Bates Clark saying, well, people are being in equilibrium, the marginal product or anything. And then secondly, we'll go over here for this, the wage rate in the modern sector will simply be equal to the wage rate in the traditional sector plus some premium, some extra pay to get people to come over and work in this sector. Great. Well, the key points here are, first of all, that there is a marginal product of labor of 0. And what does that mean? That means there is excess labor, or as he calls it, a reserve army. Remember, Marx had used terminology like that. So there's excess labor. And second important point is that wages are not set by the marginal product. Wages are set by some other sorts of rules, which fundamentally go back to how things are done in the traditional sector. Great. Well, let's graph it, and then we will see. This is a simple and kind of clever model, I think. Whether it's so or not is another question, but it's an interesting way of looking at this. And we'll start out, and we will graph the total amount of labor available on this axis. Great. And so we'll go from 0 to L bar. I think that was the symbol I was using for that population. So we have everybody graphed here. And on this axis, we're going to graph marginal product of labor in the modern sector. Okay? So if we have 0 people in the modern sector, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to there. Okay? So what would the marginal product of labor be in that sector? And let's go ahead and draw a small modern sector. And we'll do that. There's the marginal product of labor. And of course, it could become negative. That's the marginal product of labor. Given, I should write that down, given that capital is equal to some amount, and we'll call that K naught. Don't know if you can see that, but given some amount of capital, some small amount of capital, that's the demand for labor. That's the marginal product of labor. Great. Everyone else, of course, is then employed in the traditional economy. And so the marginal product of labor in that traditional economy, we'll graph that here. And maybe that looks something like this. Great. Let me draw that in there. And, of course, we have excess. All those, hang on a moment. We will now have to draw in work this. There's redraw that. The wage rate in the traditional sector, so we'll draw that in. Great. And Then we'll draw in the wage rate in the modern sector. And so that's simply the traditional wage plus the premium. Great. And that tells us now where this economy is starting out. And so that would give us L naught. That many people are employed in the modern sector earning that wage. Everybody else is in the traditional sector, and they split up what is being produced, and it happens to be that each person would get whatever that amount is. Okay? Capital determines the size of the modern sector, and the level of employment will then be set by comparing the marginal product with the wage rate, the premium plus the traditional wage. Great. Well, now suppose that there is some capital accumulation in the modern sector. And of course, now you've got this large number of people employed in the traditional sector. But suppose we have an increase in capital. And so that moves our marginal product of labor. We'll put that in. There's the marginal product of labor, given that capital is equal to K1, which is now greater than our old amount of capital. Okay, so we've increased the amount of capital, we move to there. Makes sense. And what happens? Well, now the demand for labor has increased in the modern sector, and the modern sector expands. And some people are taken away from this traditional sector, moved into the modern sector. But there's no loss over here because those people had a marginal product of 0. That was excess labor that's now being dragged over there. Great. Well, the modern sector is getting bigger with no effect on the traditional sector. Productivity and total product are unchanged over in this sector, and national income is increasing. So is inequality as we have more people who are making this higher wage. Well, we keep going with this process, and more capital accumulation, more growth, and keeps going like this, and we will, where do we want this to go? Keep shifting outwards, and eventually we will get to the point where, I'll draw something in so you can kind of see what's going on. We're going like this. We get down to here, and suddenly, at that point right there, now we can start paying people in this sector a little bit more and drag them away. We can actually move people into this modern sector. These two sectors are now starting to integrate. They're coming together. You can see that. And so any further hiring of people into this sector from this sector means that you'll have increasing marginal product of labor in that sector as we lose people here. Okay, you had to pay more to get them to come. See if that makes sense to you. This is shifting out. And we keep going like that. And at some point we're here. This is a fully integrated economy at this point. And now the only way you can expand, of course, the modern sector is by shrinking this sector at a cost in terms of output. And everybody is now earning the marginal product of labor. We have a modern economy. Okay? The modern developed economy. Make sense? It's kind of an interesting story. What is it then that led to this growth? What is it that integrated this? And the whole story is one of capital accumulation. This is the thing that drives what Rostow called takeoff and moves us into this world. This is the thing that Stalin wanted to do, was to accumulate capital and build a modern economy. If we can just accumulate capital, we will industrialize and take off. That's the idea. Well, it's an interesting idea. Arguably, there may even be some truth in this. In some respects, I think this very much describes the story of China and its takeoff, its growth, its transition beginning in 1978, when first they developed their their traditional sector, their agricultural sector, by what is de facto privatization, and then accumulating wealth, and then building the township village enterprises, which become responsible for 70% of China's growth and their increased industrial output. But at any rate, maybe there's something to this. But for the World Bank and the IMF, look at models like this and they say, aha, these are planning tools. Lewis has shown us the key to takeoff. We can see how that's done. And now we just need a way to figure out how much investment is needed. There's another set of models. I will not run through these. They can't be, I don't know of a nice way to graph them. But it's the Herod-Domar model. And it's actually from two different economists, Herod and Domar, F.C. Domar, and I can't remember Herod's name. But they both came up with models that dealt with the accumulation of capital in a Keynesian framework. And putting these together into the Herod-Domar model gives one an exact way to calculate what appears to be the exact way to calculate the needed investment to get a certain amount of economic growth. And so here's what the Herod-Domar model does, or how it is used by the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and especially the World Bank. The question is, how much investment is needed to hit a growth target? We have a target that we have for economic growth, GDP. How much capital investment do we need? And so the Herod-Domar model gives one a simple way to, first of all, one, you calculate the needed investment. And you do that, given the rate of desired growth, you do that through what is called an ICOR, which is the incremental capital output ratio. The incremental capital output ratio. Now, don't let your eyes glaze over at that. Now, what this means is how much more, what increment, what little bit of capital do you have to add to the economy to get the desired increase in output? It's a formula. It is pretty easy to calculate. Now, once you've done that, you know what that is, you then calculate what is called the financing gap. How much investment is there domestically and financing gap is how much more aid is needed from the outside. How much more foreign aid do we need given the amount of domestic investment, domestic saving, in order to get the growth target that we at the World Bank or the IMF or wherever we are have decided is important? And foreign donors, USAID, that's the United States Agency for International Development, World Bank, other kinds of international agencies, begin to pay that financing gap. They come up with this money. And of course, then the idea is economic growth and development will ensue, and great, we'll be good. And so the world will develop. All we have to do is follow the formula. Give the money to the World Bank, they'll hand it out, or give it directly. Things will be great. And the traditional economy, of course, is that's a backwards thing. This actually becomes later called the dumb peasant hypothesis by neoclassical economists who are making fun of it. And of course, then there's also the problem of insufficient investment. We just need more investment. And so what we will do, says the World Bank, we will encourage domestic mercantilists, capitalists. We will subsidize them. We will tax and squeeze the traditional sector. We'll provide foreign aid, and that's obviously going to be the right solution. Look what happens. I mean, why wouldn't it be? We have, what are we going to have? We're going to have a change of investment, and that's going to be positive. We'll invest more. And that means change of investment will give us a change in, that implies that there is a change in capital that will be positive, and that implies that there must be this great change in output that will be positive, and we have just discovered the formula for growth. There it is. And they do this. It turns out there's only one problem, and that's that no growth follows. Let's think back for a second just to that dumb peasant hypothesis. The argument that they make is that people, many of the development economists say that people in these countries don't respond to incentives. They're backwards. They have traditional culture. They're irrational. They don't understand. Marginal product and marginal utility rules, those don't apply. Those people aren't smart enough. Markets apparently don't work, so planning is needed. We'll just have to centrally plan that investment. We'll get that going there. And so it becomes, development economics really becomes the domain of the people who are most interested in central planning, as central planning becomes increasingly discredited in other circles. Well, of course, by the 1970s and 1980s, we start seeing breakdown of the Keynesian model. And we start seeing breakdown of the socialist model. And people begin rejecting, economists begin rejecting the markets don't work and the dumb peasant hypotheses, and start thinking that can't quite be right. And there's a change in thinking in development. One person who foresaw much of this, clear the board for a moment, who noticed that development economics, who believed that development economics was on a wrong track, was, my marker's goofed up somehow. Yeah, there we fix it. Lord Peter Bauer. And Lord Peter Bauer was also from London School of Economics. He had taught at London School of Economics. He was a Hungarian. He actually got his PhD at Cambridge University. He lived 1915 to 2002. So another man, of course, who knew Hayek and the other great economists at LSE. But he fully agreed with the idea of that there were structural differences with the less developed economies. But he said it was not the question of modern versus traditional economy, but something else. He said the problem is the reason these economies are split and, in a sense, divided, schizophrenic or something, wasn't modern versus traditional, but rather it was colonialism. Colonialism, the legacy was one to build interventionistic states where we had controlling bureaucracies plus a market or a productive sector. And what he rejected were the following things. He said, the dumb peasant hypothesis, as we can call it, the dumb peasant hypothesis that people are irrational and just don't respond to incentives is false. He said that should be replaced instead with the malicious bureaucrat hypothesis. That is to say, these are economies. The colonial legacy is that we have a legacy of rent seeking. that suppresses economic growth. And, he argued, private entrepreneurship would work very well, but it is regulated. It will work if it is permitted to do so, but it is restrained. And foreign aid from World Bank, from the IMF, from the USAID, from all the rest, foreign aid entrenches bureaucrats. It makes things worse. It impoverishes countries. And that's why after these countries become independent, these colonies become independent, the tendency is for their economies to go down, not up. And he says his diagnosis, his solution is free markets, free trade, and private property. That is to say, he calls for institutional change. Institutional change based on, of course, the market system. Private property being an important prerequisite. Let these people open up their economies. This later, with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, informs what is called the Washington Consensus. And the argument there is to liberalize prices, have macroeconomic stability, open up the economy to free trade, and privatize. And of course, things that are done incompletely. But the argument is institutions matter. And of course, people like Douglas North, Deidre McCloskey, and William Easterly make these arguments. Easterly has a very interesting case here. I should mention him. He's got a number of books out, but you might be able to see that. William Easterly, The Elusive Quest for Growth. He covers the story of the I-Corps in here. But Easterly was the head of the Economic Growth Research Unit at the World Bank. And what Easterly noticed was that the things that the World Bank was doing weren't working very well. And so he and his team of researchers began studying World Bank policy, and they came out with a very big series of papers about why everything the World Bank was doing was wrong and was a failure. For his work, he received a wonderful promotion. He was fired, basically fired, and ended up as a tenured professor at NYU. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but the financing gap model with the I-Corps makes a prediction for the, this is pretty typical, but Zambia in southern Africa. The country of Zambia, if you can see the graph, the dotted line down here, well, this is what the I-Corps, what the World Bank, given what they were investing in Zambia, what the Zambian economy should have done on a per capita basis. And that's what it actually did, which is to go from very low to even lower per capita incomes. So a failure. So the development economics is basically a story of failure. Great. That's a kind of an interesting story to me. I think what I will do is emphasize that what we do know from development, and that's that it appears that capital accumulation and investment doesn't help at all. Not if you have a corrupt system or you don't have markets. On the other hand, it appears that if you have free markets, you'll get economic growth because you will be able to harness the knowledge of people, and they will respond to the incentives and be able to figure out what they can do to make their lives better. When I mentioned Sir Arthur Lewis, talked about him, there's something I said that I wanted to bring your attention to because I think it's actually one of the really important lessons from Lewis. And that was his quote about being raised by his mother after his father died. And again, what he said was, she was the most highly disciplined and hardest working person I've ever known. And what she did was she taught her sons that lesson. And it is that passing on of human capital that really leads, at the individual level, that leads to economic growth. That's the microeconomics of growth. That plus the institutions that allow that to be harnessed. Great. Well, that's my little story on development economics. I know many times students become very excited about development economics and think about, I think as Robert Lucas put it, when you think about what is at stake, it's hard not to be excited about this. When you look at the third world, the undeveloped world, and think about how people could be lifted out of poverty. The problem is that development economics hasn't done anything for that. If anything, it's made it worse. And I know that students often will tell me, I want to go into development economics because it looks so exciting. It's exciting. Don't go into development economics. You want to do something in the developing world, go study something useful. Agricultural economics, healthcare economics, civil engineering, something like this. And become really good at that. And then go and share those skills or that knowledge.